On the 16th of September 2020, Mark Zuckerberg announced Assassin's Creen Nexus alongside a Splinter Cell VR game. These projects were some of the biggest names we've ever seen in VR outside of Half-Life Alyx, of course. We waited and waited to hear something about these games and nothing came. When news finally came, it wasn't looking good. Ubisoft finally broke its silence to announce that Assassin's Creed was still coming, but Splinter Cell VR had been cancelled. VR community kind of began to worry that Assassin's Creen Nexus won't see the light of day, until we started seeing leaks of the game's menu. It was only a menu, but it was still hope. Then, finally, on June 12th, Ubisoft showed off the first official trailer at Ubisoft Connect. This trailer generated a ton of hype around VR and Assassin's Creed, as it's going to be the first time Assassin's Creed was able to be experienced in first person. Assassin's Creen Nexus finally released on November 16th to raving reviews from many users and was dubbed AAA VR done right, and what VR had been missing. All of these statements were met with agreement from the standalone VR community, while the non-standalone VR community, from PC VR to PlayStation VR 2, cited games like Half-Life Alyx and Horizon Call of the Mountain being the pinnacle of AAA VR. For me personally, I think Assassin's Creed Nexus, although it is AAA and does do a lot for VR overall as a whole, unfortunately, some of the shortcomings really made me scratch my head in confusion and wondering if this game was really made with VR in mind. Since this game's been out for a while, and I'm always late with these long-form reviews, please expect minor spoilers, but nothing major when it comes to the story overall. Introductions out of the way, I want to welcome you to another Butters review that's long enough to make your trip to the DMV look short. Starting with the story, Assassin's Creen Nexus puts you in the shoes of an independent hacker hired by the Brotherhood and tasked with infiltrating Abstergo's cloud infrastructure. You've been hired by Dominica Wilk, who is voiced by Morena Baccarin, an Abstergo executive working on a small side project known as the Nexus Eye. Dominica wants you to find the pieces of the Antikythera mechanism inside the Abstergo cloud off the books and provide whatever information you gather to her directly and nobody else. If you don't know what the Abstergo cloud is, this is where all of the Templar and the Brotherhood memories of their past ancestry are held, and this is how you go back and play as Cassandra, Ezio, and Connor. While you're doing this, your Brotherhood contacts Sean, who's voiced by Danny Wallace, and Rebecca, who's voiced by Eliza Schneider, are setting up what are known as logic bombs. And if you're wondering, like I was, why didn't they think of a better name? That's because these are real-world things. These are executable programs that will activate whenever a specific parameter is met. Usually something like spyware or Trojans get put onto the system and deletes or grabs whatever data it needs to, all through a back door. And it just so happens that you have access to all of the Abstergo cloud infrastructure, and you become that back door. At the end of each mission, you're going to activate one of these logic bombs and delete whatever information was in the memory you just went through. But after the first few go unnoticed, the Abstergo Hunter Protocol, which is essentially the firewall, activates, and Dominica starts looking at you with a lot more suspicion and keeping a much more watchful eye. As most of the early story was all from outside the Animus and was not front and center, I was not very interested in what was going on. I'd go into a Brotherhood assassin's memory, eliminate a few enemies, and then come back. It was not until the Hunter Protocol activated that I became very interested in the main story. I felt like everything really started to become higher stakes at this point, not just me going to a destination, but now I was worried what was going on outside the simulation, or worse, what was coming into them. I would still like to give the story credit though. The writers did a fantastic job at helping people understand the story behind the Brotherhood and the Templars. They give enough surface level information for you to understand which faction is which, as well as which faction holds which beliefs. So if you're new to the Assassin's Creed franchise, I think that this is probably a perfectly fine place to start. Yeah, maybe you don't have all the details, but this is enough of a story to get you started and maybe get you really interested in the Assassin's Creed franchise as a whole. One thing I do want to add here is that I hope this was developed in such a way that it was more of a test bed to potentially bring a new assassin into the fold of the Brotherhood. By all means, I think Ubisoft can definitely continue to use this formula where maybe they use another additional 3 assassins and bring them into the VR universe and add some addition to their story with these side stories. But that's just me. Moving on to gameplay and the gameplay loop of Assassin's Creed, the Assassin's Creed Nexus loop changes depending upon what memory you are playing. The full playthrough took me around 15 hours to complete, with minimal side content actually being touched for the 100% completion. So keep that in mind, you are going to have more time if you want to do all that side content. For me, I just really wanted to know what was there and didn't really touch it too much after that. I think overall this is definitely more than acceptable for a VR game. We definitely pay a little bit more for even shorter games, mind you, on some occasions. That being said, when I talk about memories and it being kind of different overall what that loop's going to be, for example, one memory had me breaking into a prison to find a contact for the Brotherhood and escorting that contact out of the prison to a safe house. Another mission had me performing a public execution. There are many different ways to play that evolve over time as you progress through each assassin's individual story. Each of these stories concludes with their respective overarching villain fights, and there is one that to me felt unique and different from the rest of the game, and I'm not saying this in a bad way at all. It's something that we've similarly seen in the franchise as a whole, but I don't think this is how or where I would have wanted the game to conclude. However, before I can get into that and why that is, let's move back to the start of the game and talk about its very unique opening style. There's one issue we have in the community, and it's not related to skill. That issue is mixed feelings surrounding mixed reality. And feel free to watch this video in the top right, open it in a new tab, and save it for after this one. But when mixed reality was announced as something that would launch with the Quest 3, I felt that it would be one of the biggest selling points to those currently outside of VR, and we've seen with the Apple Vision Pro that is true. But I never thought that mixed reality was going to offer me something that immersed me even more within a VR experience. Assassin's Creed Nexus uses mixed reality to immerse the player in their role by adding a mixed reality overlay to their play space, meaning that you are not, so to speak, full dive into VR yet, but you're actually standing in the hacker's room. When this happened, my mind was blown because from an RPG perspective, this is literally putting me in the shoes of the protagonist. Something that I think many didn't fully grasp in their reviews upon release. It's definitely easy to overlook, but this mixed reality area is you. You are the hacker, and when you're in this, you're accessing a secure connection between Sean and Rebecca. Each time you're here, you're going to have to unencrypt that connection with a puzzle that every single time you get here becomes more and more challenging as you progress. Don't get me wrong, I think this is really cool, and from a design standpoint, it's fantastic. However, if you take too long on these puzzles, Rebecca's gonna be in your ear yelling at you and telling you you're slow. Unfortunately, after you complete these puzzles, you're brought into what I would say is probably the least visually pleasing area of Assassin's Creed Nexus, and that's these virtual meetings. You'll kind of go into these areas after you complete one of these puzzles 9 out of 10 times, and the reprojection in here is just really bad. I feel like that's due to the particle effects and just the amount of stuff going on, and I think they could have just as easily had some sort of indicator to kind of say, hey, this is a virtual meeting between you and Dominica, you're not actually in her office or at Abstergo headquarters. to kind of really sell that, rather than having all this what I would consider to be soap opera effect when it comes to the overall explanation of how this is what it is and how this is all working. We use VR. We have things like VR Chat and Horizon Worlds that have realistic spaces in the virtual world. We will understand that this is virtual. The very first mission serves as a beginner tutorial. There are advanced tutorials that will be later levels, but this kind of goes to the basics that the Assassin's Creed franchise as a whole is known for. The climbing, the combat, the stealth. These are going to be very beginner tutorials within this first level, just so you can kind of see how the overall flow of the game is going to be. And they do a great job, but as we get to each of these steps, I will go into greater detail about the flaws in design, as well as what I enjoy about them. Upon starting the level, you are talking with your Brotherhood contacts, Sean and Rebecca, and they kind of explain who the Brotherhood is, what their values are, and the reason for you working with them. You then meet with Dominica, who is the Abstergo executive that hired you based on the history you have within your hacking portfolio, so to speak. They do not have a lack of resources at Abstergo. She kind of introduces you to the surface level views of the Templar and a little bit of their history, but Sean and Rebecca are more of the story interjectors here when it comes to who the Templar are. And all of this meeting with both of these, all of these individuals in both parties is virtual, but in Dominica's, as you heard earlier with the whole reprojection issue, hers is more present, if that makes sense. And this is also confirmed to be virtual, not just by visuals here, but she does this cool, grab hand motion on her face. And that's her removing a VR headset. I mentioned it here. Most people that have played this have noticed it, and they've probably talked about it to their friends. I just love small details like this, and I just think it's really cool that we can actually see somebody grab a non-physical object in that virtual space, but physical in the real world, and see them remove it. You're then prompted with a small questionnaire on what your experience is in VR, and this is going to be the first time of many that I have mentioned, or will mention, a new standard being set for virtual reality as a whole. Ubisoft doing this, and Red Storm Studios putting this in the game and just setting the standard right then and there, saying, hey, look, what is your experience? We don't want you to have a bad time. Here are your options. Have you done VR before? If you have you used controllers for movement? And so on. These are just basic questions that can then make it so that the devs can cater a design or a recommendation of movement mechanics and comfort settings for you. And I think this is and needs to be a new standard for VR. I understand if you're a stationary game, that's a little bit different, but if you have smooth locomotion, you're a single player game, I recommend something like this in your game 100% to make sure that players that get into VR aren't having a bad experience. Although I did set mine up at the beginning, it did force me to set mine up again, but the fact that this questionnaire is there, any gripe that I had with having to do it again is kind of out the window at that point. It will be a gripe a little bit later, but as of right now, I am more forgiving in this instance because of how it's set up, and I'm glad that it still prompted me to do this because it means that I could actually see this feature that they added. The first skill you'll learn as an assassin is stealth. This consists of two sub-skills. One is avoiding detection, and the other is causing distractions. The causing distractions part is pretty easy. You can use just about anything in your environment that you can pick up, as well as throwing knives, arrows, heck, you can even throw your bow if you really want to. All of this is just sound-based detection. They don't necessarily know what fell or what was thrown. They just know that they heard a sound. They also did a really cool thing when it comes to the avoiding detection part of the game. The devs over at Red Storm actually made it so that your torso is what triggers the visual cue for NPCs. Your head will never trigger a visual cue. So if you peek over a bench or you're peeking around a corner and your head is visible, that's okay. You need to gather information. And that's what the developers intended. They know that we need to be able to see where we're going. And without actually being able to peek, we can't do that. So bravo to the devs for making it and kind of thinking of this in a sense of we need our players to gather information, and they can't do that if we're using the head as what is being seen by these enemies. One thing I do want to mention about stealth is virtual crouch. It is in the game, it's available, and usually for the most part, I'll use it if I'm just trying to not sweat a whole bunch because I'm crouching constantly and getting back up and going back down, because this is a stealth game. You're going to be doing that a lot. So for me, I used virtual crouch, but I noticed that even when virtually crouching, I would need to bend my knees a little bit and crouch down just a little bit. Not too much, but still, I'm not sure if this was a design oversight or if this is how it was actually designed and this is what they wanted to happen. Either way, I think it's a little weird to offer a virtual crouch that's not going to work correctly and make it so that your players still need to crouch down even more to not have their torso spotted by enemies. To me, this is something that would be used by those with bad knees or those who are in a wheelchair or have, mobility issues. You can't necessarily have those people crouch or hunch over more. You don't want to do that in your game. I do also want to mention that they have stealth difficulty. So as I played on the hardest difficulty in the game, I automatically started the higher difficulty, which is fine for me. I'm not too worried about it. You are spotted by enemies quicker, so you kind of have to use your environment to really get around, and that's okay. I'm not too worried about that. The biggest thing that I was worried about, which happens 1% of the time and overall isn't even necessarily worth mentioning, but I'm going to mention it because this is a review, is whenever I had to do some sort of public assassination in front of a lot of guards or crowds, I would get spotted in a way that I felt was much too quick. I felt that there were areas that it could have improved on, or maybe, potentially, I'm just bad at the game, which is wholeheartedly possible, and if that seems to be the case by the footage you're seeing here, let me know in the comments below that I suck. One thing that you're not going to learn in this beginning part, but I still want to talk about, is hiding. You're going to be hiding in hay bales, bushes, crowds, and you'll even be swimming underwater. With this mechanic, the devs have actually done some amazing things and actually indicated visually by having the player's hood become raised and then highlighting it around your peripherals. So to me, I think visually this is something that adds a lot more immersion, but also makes it so that the player knows, hey, you are in fact hidden, you don't need to worry about it, without putting something in the center of your screen saying hidden. They've added that additional level of immersion. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little thrown off by what this was, because before I actually was given the tutorial for this, I just went into a hay bale because that's what you do. You know Assassin's Creed, you see hay, you gotta jump into it. So I didn't really understand what it was until I did, and for me, I think it was one of the cooler mechanics that they did. One last final detail that I kind of want to get into on this is crowds. It's actually indicated on the ground that these crowds are big enough for you to hide in. So whenever you walk into and mingle with these people, so to speak, your hood will come up and indicate, yes, you are in hiding. But if you're ever unsure if a group of people is big enough for you to actually hide in, you can go ahead and look at the floor and you'll be able to see that foggy circle indicating, yes, this group of people is big enough for you to hide within. When you think about the assassin's main weapon, what comes to mind? To me, it's the hidden blade. And I'm going to say in Assassin's Creed Nexus, you're going to be seeing a lot of the hidden blade. This thing is amazing. From performing air assassinations to just assassinations in general with this, it was something that I just found myself immensely satisfied with. Visually, I will be honest, it can be a little bit jank because whenever you stab someone in the back or don't grab them just right, it feels a little weird, it just looks a little weird. I found myself walking around a lot, just unsheathing and resheathing it, whether I was listening to dialogue or just roaming a city. And For me, it kind of felt like that instinct when you grab a drill and you just have to pull the trigger. I don't know what it is about, our weird brains, but it's just, I have to do this. This just feels right. There are 2 additional bonuses I did want to talk about, because when performing air assassinations, you can actually use your sword, and this is a first time for me in Assassin's Creed. I don't know if there's any other game that I could use my main weapon to actually perform an aerial assassination. So when I did that and I, held the A button and jumped off wherever I was and realized, oh no, I didn't activate my hidden blade, I just tried to use my sword, it worked. And that was awesome. The second thing was they kept lore accuracy with Cassandra's blade. I didn't realize that Cassandra only had 1 blade and it was in her left hand, but they indicated it to me at the beginning and I continually forgot. The first time you're introduced to Cassandra, you actually see and are told, hey, Cassandra only has 1 hidden blade on her left hand. You're not going to be using it right. To me, I think this is a fantastic call and says, hey, this is the lore. We're going to stay accurate to it. Suck it up if you're going to be bad. And that was me. I decided that the right hand was the way to go with a few of these assassinations, just to figure out, oh yeah, I forgot. She only has a left hand hidden blade. Before I start talking about the actual combat mechanics, I want to start by going off script really quickly and stating that I know that this game is designed as a stealth experience, and I have no qualms with that. It reminds me of the old Assassin's Creeds, and that's why I really like this game, but I'm still going to talk about the sword combat and critique a lot of it, because from a VR perspective, there's some no-nos in here that just shouldn't be happening and have been known about for a while now as no-nos. And for anybody that's made it this far that feels the need to go around and hack and slash and that wants to, that's going to be their main play style, please just leave the video. This game's not going to be for you. I respect the way that you want to play, but you're not going to be happy with what I talk about in this next section, and you're 100% not going to get this game if you're focused on hack and slash combat. I feel one of the most disappointing parts of Assassin's Creed Nexus is its sword combat. There was a lot they could have done to improve it, but it seems there was no intention to actually focus on changing it at all, regardless of your character asking for higher difficulty.
Not bad for your first time in the Animus.
I'm a quick study. Now how about we take the training wheels off?
You unfortunately will never be able to make the sword combat feel real since there's no physics behind it. Although you may be told that in the tutorial you're not swinging hard enough, it really means you're just not swinging fast enough. How do I know this? Well, I can flick my wrist and it feels like Skyrim VR. Yes, Assassin's Creed Nexus is using a system as complicated as Skyrim VR for its sword combat. You can swing your sword as fast as you want, just by pivoting your wrist, and it'll count. Did I do this a lot? No, I didn't, but it's not helpful that I know that it's doable. Games like Blade and Sorcery or Grimlord don't actually allow this to happen, as their weapons are physics-based. Behind every individual weapon, there's individual physics calculations. From daggers to longswords, every weapon offers a different feel and is treated as such. Whereas Assassin's Creed, whether you're using a sword, a short sword, or a tomahawk, they all just feel like they have the same physics. Sword physics are not the only downside to combat, and I would say it's probably not even combat's biggest issue. That honor goes to the lack of real-time combat. But before I can talk about why, I want to thank our sponsors. You who are watching the video, leaving likes on my videos, subscribing to the channel, all of that helps more people discover what we are trying to accomplish here. I would just want to make deep dive reviews that go into every aspect, every detail of game design and level design in VR, and you clicking the like button helps that happen. So again, I want to thank you, and let's get back to the video. Real-time combat was a joke since we very first saw it, and we didn't want to believe it. You can go back to the trailers and you'll see comments stating, what's up with the pause during combat? And a lot of people were kind of worried about this, and we, again, hoped we could turn this off. Unfortunately, you can't. I have my game on the highest difficulty setting, and it also doesn't stop. This gives me the vibe of Infinity Blade, where it has like this quick time or bullet time event where you're supposed to parry or slash or what have you during this specific type of window. And to me, I don't want that. I'm in VR. I am here to be immersed. And you pausing mid-combat to say, oh, here you go. Get ready for it, champ. I don't need that. It is horrible. And I think one of the biggest reasons it's bad is because, moreover, the difficulty setting being high, but also there's no player agency in this. It's all automatically decided. It's not a power. It could have easily been a power stated at the beginning of the game. Say, oh, hey, you know, if you press this button and hold it down, it'll make it so time slows and you move fluidly like you regularly would. And that would be perfectly fine. No, they didn't do that. They made it automatic. And even when you raise your difficulty setting, it doesn't turn this off, but instead only offers what every other game in the modern day is doing, where it's enemies get to hit you 10 times harder and you have less health, and then you get to hit them like you're hitting them with a tiny soft pillow. It doesn't make any sense. If you're going to have difficulty, differentiate those difficulties within your combat. They differentiated in stealth. They could have done it in combat if they wanted to. So for me, these fights just aren't it. And as I said, not even 5 minutes ago, it's a stealth game, and I get that, but player agency is much more important to the experience than holding a hand of someone that has their difficulty on the highest possible setting. The final issue I have is kind of a mix for me. I can't say it's bad. Well, I guess I could say it's bad, but at the same time, it is consistent in every single Assassin's Creed game for the franchise. Multi-enemy combat does not have multiple enemies really attack you at the same time simultaneously. They have multiple enemies on screen, and they do the same thing in Assassin's Creed Nexus, but it feels more like a line for people to line up and have their chance to fight the champion, so to speak. And this doesn't change with difficulty, which I think it potentially could. From a design perspective, they do have an indicator indicating, hey, you have an enemy coming from your left and an enemy coming from your right, or what have you. And this is in your periphery. You can see this. It's easily indicated. And I think you could do something more like a spider sense or something along those lines if they wanted to. But again, this one here, I'm not really going to minus points because it is consistent from the Assassin's Creed franchise that you don't necessarily always have multiple enemies attacking you at the same time. We are finally at the end of the beginner tutorial, and I know we're only a half hour into this video. Trust, I understand it's long. I just love the technical breakdowns of a lot of these games when I review them. So bear with me. I appreciate you making it this far. And let's talk about these final two mechanics that you're going to be dealing with. One is enemy marking. Enemy marking is all based on the glance of your headset. So if you're on Quest 2 or Quest 3, you're going to kind of have to center your headset on an enemy to mark them, and that will permanently mark them. Regardless of where they walk, if they go out of sight, doesn't matter. You will always know where they are. Sometimes requiring that centering on the Quest 2 and Quest 3 can feel a little weird, but overall, it is implemented very well and is probably a great thing to have as a beginner player. I do wish on the higher difficulty again that they could offer an option to turn this off, but I'm not going to complain about that one any more than I already have. As for the parkour and the climbing, Assassin's Creed Nexus does a fantastic job and really does bring me back to my childhood when I was running across the rooftops of Boston and Italy on my PlayStation 3. This right here is fantastic parkour. They even have the part where, or I guess ability to kind of throw yourself up the wall faster, and we'll talk about that as we get there in the advanced tutorial, because for me, that was one of my favorite parts, is just scaling something really tall with speed. The advanced tutorial takes place over the next 2 levels, teaching you about unblockable attacks, dodging, and the franchise's defining mechanic, the leap of faith. you don't like heights, don't worry. They thought of that. You're asked before you even do your first jump if you're afraid of heights, which really shows the work they put into the new VR user and kind of really thought about the newcomers to VR. This is the first mechanic you'll learn in the advanced tutorial, and it's used by activating your Animus Scout function. This is for marking enemies and activates on a per level basis at the respective level's first leap of faith point. Eagle Eye will also be activated during this as well. During this level, you're going to be revisiting a very important location to Ezio and the Assassin's Creed series as a whole, where you meet his sister. You're going to learn a little bit about the location as well as the role that his sister does play within the Brotherhood's organization, which, again, the writers did a fantastic job bringing all of these worlds together in a way that kind of didn't really require any previous experience with the Assassin's Creed franchise at all. After meeting his sister, you're given a key to access the attic and are tasked with solving a puzzle. Now, I do want to stop right here really quick and just say that the key, as you can see, disappears from my hand. It goes into an out of sight, out of mind inventory, where wherever you go, whenever you need that piece, it will spawn in your hand and you will be able to interact. You don't need to worry about which key is which, or where does this key go, or what does this piece need. It automatically pops into your hand when you need it. So there's no need to worry about stuff like that. One thing I didn't like about this instance is as soon as I was done reading Da Vinci's note, I was automatically prompted to activate my Animus Pulse. It's a tutorial, so I get it, but maybe it should have been done a little bit later in an area where it felt more needed, so to speak. Because at this point, it's a 10 by 10 room. I'm not really going to get too annoyed trying to find whatever piece I need for this puzzle. And on a more VR-centric note, there's a mask in here that I think they just didn't want you to find. I'm kidding. But there was a mask in here that I wanted to put on my face, and I couldn't. If you're someone that's already played the game and you're kind of just watching for my commentary on it, did you try and put this mask on as well? I tried it with every single mask I saw. Just let me know in the comments below if you tried to do it with this mask. So after you finish your puzzle, your location is now under siege, and you need to clear the building of all intruders. However, the game immediately decides again to hold your hand and force you to access Animus Pulse. I'm not saying that they're going to give me the option. It is click this or we're going to keep showing on your screen. Now, although I'm annoyed with this mechanic, I think that the way that they grab your attention is fantastic. And I think the way that they show the player in the headset that, hey, this is the button you're looking for is great. This is one of those things that I said is setting a standard within VR. And I think overall, this is a new standard that needs to become standard practice. Put an opaque controller in your player's hand, and when you tell them to activate something, show them what that button is. Show them where that is on the controller. That is awesome. I love this. And I think that, again, for those new users, it is fantastic. However, forcing me to do this by continually having it blink over and over and it never going away, even if I look at the prompt multiple times, is not good. And to me, it's counterintuitive. If I've looked at it multiple times, I'm obviously not trying to activate it. So for me, this, as a veteran player, becomes more of a nuisance than a welcome addition to my experience when I'm playing Assassin's Creed Nexus, because although they need to teach new players, if I'm a veteran that looks at it 4 times, you should know by that time I don't want to activate it, but I know what it does. After clearing the interior, you're told to go to the basement and clear out the tunnels. This is where you start the advanced fighting tutorial. You first learn to parry, which I can't really say for certain I fully understood at the time, because it didn't really offer any feedback. And the feedback sound that it did offer didn't seem to register any differently from the regular sound when I was fighting. So by the end of this tutorial, it said good job, but I didn't understand what I did to actually parry. Later in the game, I did notice that there is a sound trigger that becomes much clearer, but in the tutorial, I didn't actually get that sound cue, and if I did, I didn't notice it again. Maybe implementing sound dodging so it triggers that sound better and has it pop through is probably a good option for those tutorials, Not necessarily saying that they didn't do that and it may have just been an issue on my end, but maybe make that sound a lot louder within the tutorial just to kind of say, hey, this is the sound that you're looking for. Which is funny because this entire time, the amount of hand holding that has been happening with forced interactions and prompts to help me grasp a concept kind of makes it a little weird that I didn't fully grasp this one, but they said, oh, yep, you got it, good job, and I didn't really understand if I'd gotten it. They then teach you how to combat dash. Now, you can use this in two different ways. You can either use it to quick dodge or to push enemies off balance during combat. I wasn't really sure how I was going to use this or when I was going to use this, but I knew that when I saw a broken heart icon above an enemy, if I was far enough away, I wanted to close that gap, and it was going to pretty much be an indicator that I would one-hit kill whatever I'm going after in this specific instance. Most of the time I use this as a dodge, but again, throughout my entire playthrough, this didn't really come in handy unless I was trying to close some sort of gap on an enemy that either had that icon above them, or I wasn't trying to get spotted and they were about to turn around on their patrol. This last tutorial was where I really cemented the thought process of, yeah, combat's not going to be doing anything massively different from what I'm getting right here. Enemies pretty much lining up in a polite line, waiting their turn to fight me and be killed, was just a huge letdown, and when I'm playing on the hardest difficulty, again, it just is kind of lackluster and doesn't really give me any reason to. I might as well at that point in time have just turned it all the way back down to easy, since it's no different except health bars and damage done to me. After the dash tutorial is over, that is actually the very first ability you unlock on your chart. The graphics and icons are easy to understand and pop up anytime you unlock a new ability, which is usually at the end of a mission. This is designed that so you not only know when an ability is unlocked, but if you're unsure what you did or what you're able to do, you can go back and actually consult these menus and relearn that ability if you've forgotten what it does or how it works. Other than seeing what's been unlocked, there's no reason to ever go back to this screen unless you forget, and the abilities all unlock in a specific order anyway and doesn't really have any effect on your character past the first 2 or 3 unlocks. This is to ensure that players are not unlocking upgrades that they won't be able and are going to assume might upgrade and allow them to unlock things. All of these upgrades are given to you after you unlock these respective pieces of equipment, so you're not wasting points or anything like that. I did hate it at first, but thinking about it from a design perspective, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it just makes it so that people don't waste their time unlocking something that they can't really use. One thing that I do hate, however, is that it automatically unlocks a second life for you. So if you go down during combat, you'll get right back up, and I don't like that. It's stupid. It's dumb. I want the game to be difficult. Stop hand-holding. Let me decide if I want to unlock that. Continuing your chase through the tunnels, you are taught advanced movement methods like running up walls, advanced climbing, aerial assassinations, and how to swing across gaps using flagpoles. All of these are explained very well and are designed in a way that are believable within the world. And as I mentioned earlier, you do need to hold A while running and jumping up against these walls to kind of fling yourself up and give yourself that initial momentum to be able to quickly then grab and fling yourself up continually. The fluid motion in this just feels natural and really does feel like second nature, and the attention to detail given to this mechanic really does excel when you flawlessly perform consecutive leaping motions up these walls, because the momentum that you had before you threw yourself up continues to the next grab and the next grab and the next grab. And if you descend and, say you miss your grip point, they have the hook that allows you to kind of slow down on your wall grab to kind of find where you need to grab next. So great mechanic, not punishing, and personally, this is something that I don't mind the hand holding on, because sometimes you miss your grip point and you're pretty high up and you don't want to fall down and take that additional fall damage. After this, you're taught aerial assassinations, and this is activated by holding either the player's weapon or unsheathing your hidden blade, glancing at your target, and holding A while walking off whatever elevated platform you're on. If you don't hold A, you're gonna become annoyed, because I forgot many times after my first session that holding A made it so it activated aerial assassinations. So I would walk off roofs and just find myself frustrated because, one, I made sounds so now I'm detected, and two, the feeling that I get from these is so satisfying that missing the opportunity to do them is annoying, and it just feels like I need to load the game or automatically just fail on purpose because of how dumb I was to not hold this A button. And don't worry, again, if you have a fear of heights, regardless of how high this roof is you're jumping off of, the fear of heights option will trigger, as well as to counter motion sickness, time slows and makes it so that, kind of like Half-Life Alyx, you don't have that immense amount of inertia kind of going through your body, if that makes sense. Or for those that have been motion sick in the past, you know the feeling of your stomach dropping when you're moving a little bit quickly. Swinging is also done really well in Assassin's Creed Nexus, and I can say with confidence that the fluidity in which you swing from a pole, hit the platform, and swing again feels amazing. It feels like you would really do that if you were someone that is professionally performing parkour like this. In games like Uncharted, it kind of feels like you get slowed momentum when you do these things, but in Assassin's Creed Nexus, I don't really feel like I have any slowed momentum. However, I want to warn anybody that's tall or that has low ceilings or a ceiling fan, please try and match your paint color and watch out for that fan. The last part of this tutorial you're going to learn is unblockable attacks and dodging. Dodging requires you to either physically move left to the right or duck, as well as being able to back up from these attacks. Now, most of the time you're going to be dodging left and right is more than likely going to be at some sort of ranged attack, whether that be a bow and arrow or a musket being shot at you. And usually when you need to duck for an attack, it's usually something like a slash that's coming from somebody's sword. However, you don't necessarily need to duck for these. You can also just back up because they're not necessarily lunging at you, and there's no, I guess, kind of magnetic damage, if that makes sense. So like if you play like Dark Souls or something like that, and you think that you dodge, but you do it a little too early, it doesn't magically continue to hit you if you don't hit the right iframe. It's just you back away. And that's, overall pretty accurate when it comes to the sword combat, and I think that's the most accurate part of the combat realistically. However, there are two different things that they do here, or I'm going to change it a little bit on how I feel about this little slowdown that we have, this bullet time, if you will. Firstly, they give you an indicator. They say, hey, you're going to have to duck or move left and right, and they give you these little indicators in your face on some sort of HUD, if you will. Contrary to everything that I have said up to this point about this slowing of attacks in regular combat, I'm going to agree with it here due to the fact that you are going to be hit a little bit harder by these attacks. You're also going to be more punished, and you're being given the opportunity to dodge, and if you're not paying attention, obviously you're not going to do it right. Even if they do this, they still do it in every other combat scenario, so it kind of loses its unique appeal that it could have. For me, the way that I see it is if they made all the other combat real time, but these unblockable attacks some sort of bullet time like we have them now, where it slows down time and allows me to dodge or do what I need to do to get out of the way, I could have that, feeling like a badass moment and being that guy. Instead, since every other attack kind of has this pause at the climax of the enemy swing, it just feels like any other piece of combat, but my enemy's sword is blinking red. This next particular skill, I'm not even sure if you can call it a skill or maybe, I guess a tactic, if you will, is never shown off, never taught in-game, but I found myself, as soon as I accidentally discovered it, changing the way that I have my stance. And what I mean by stance is how I hold my weapon. You can actually change the way that your weapon is gripped within Assassin's Creed Nexus, and it is never told to you. If you hold the trigger down and flick your wrist downward, you can have either the tomahawk or your sword extend your entire forearm, and you can actually swing and block that way. For me personally, I just found this to be 110 times better. I don't know what it is about using my forearm as some sort of, I guess, shield, really, because that's what I used my sword as, was parries and all that stuff. I liked this a lot better, and I found that using my forearm to attack enemies and parry and block just felt much more natural than actually holding it out as an extension of my being. I don't know why this is, but it also kind of annoys me that it was never talked about in the entire game. So if you haven't played Assassin's Creed Nexus and you've made it this far into the review, 1, congratulations. 2, definitely try this out. See if you like this a little bit better. And if you had played Assassin's Creed Nexus and you're going back to it, try this. Finally, most of the tutorials out of the way, you are introduced to Cassandra, which is officially the 4th mission, I believe. Her first mission does take place in Greece, and this is where you're gonna get the bow. To me, the bow is probably one of my favorite weapons. However, the bow is my favorite weapon in any game that offers a bow. I do want to talk about the throwing knives first, because although you do obtain them in the previous mission, you don't really get to use them too much because you only start with 2, and they kind of want you to interact with the environment with those right off the bat, where you have to throw them and knock down crates to kind of distract guards or take out guards that are under them, which is cool. I'm very happy that they've offered an avenue for those players that want to be able to use the environment to take out their enemies. I thoroughly enjoy that, and I really do find myself using that as needed. Not as much as I probably would if I was just going to use throwing knives to take out enemies. Now, that being said, both the throwing knife and the bow are going to play a little bit different. However, damage-wise, they do the same exact thing. If you are already spotted by an enemy, it is going to take you both of your throwing knives in this mission. You only start with 2, you can have up to 5 if I remember correctly, and here you only have 2. So if you're already spotted by the enemy standing in front of you, it's going to take you both of those throwing knives to take them out. Yes, you can pull them from the enemies just like you can with the arrows. However, if you're not spotted, it's only going to take 1 throwing knife. Now, this may sound like a damage inconsistency and just bad design. Realistically, I think this is great design. I think that encouraging your player to play stealthily as you would in an Assassin's Creed game encourages your player to play as such. And I think that you being spotted deserves you having to use 2 knives to actually take out whatever enemies in front of you. Unlocking the bow during this mission is part of a puzzle, and we're going to get there, but before we can even start that puzzle and get to where we obtain the bow, we actually need to do a little bit of breaking and entering. And this is where the lock-picking mechanic comes in. And for me personally, this is one of the most well thought out and well-designed mechanics in all of Assassin's Creed Nexus. I know it sounds dumb, but realistically, having you pick a lock with depth detection as well as kind of a rotation motion, it's awesome. It's great. And like any other quest item, when you need this item, it will just pop out. So if you can unlock something that's locked, put your hands near it if you think you can, and it will pop into your hand if you are able to unlock this. The only downside to this mechanic, realistically, is that after a while, it does kind of start to show the same patterns. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's the worst thing in the world, but I'm wondering how much more work it would have been to add some sort of variety in this. Yes, it originally starts with around 2 to 3 locks that you have to unlock and eventually gets to like 5 or 6, but the position of all of these just stays consistently the same, and I'm not really excited about that overall. I'm not going to say that I'm super disappointed, but I think there could have been some more variety with this mechanic if I'm being honest. After you complete this quest, you get the bow, which damage-wise is similar to the knives as mentioned earlier. If you are unnoticed, you will only need one shot from the bow to actually down an enemy, but if you are noticed, just like the knives, it will take 2 shots. Now, keep in mind, as fast as you can draw that bow is as fast as you can shoot it, and there's no real issue there overall. With this though, the only downside is I will always be accurate with it, because the bow is glance based. It's not actual skills. There's no way to disable that. I'm never going to be able to. There's no update coming out that I know of that's going to allow me to disable that. And glance accuracy just kind of takes the enjoyment that I get from bows, or even crossbows in the case of Ezio, just not really enjoyable. For me, it's the skill that it takes to take that shot from a distance and say, am I going to hit my target? Not, oh, I'm looking at this target. I already know I'm going to hit it, so there's no tension here, and I'm not worried. That's probably my biggest disappointment with both the bows and the knives. I can kind of get it with the knives because when you throw in VR, it just doesn't feel like it's always going to be accurate. And overall, for me, I have only found probably 2 or 3 games that have really made me feel like my throwing is actually throwing and it doesn't feel weird. However, I will say there is one mechanic that came out absolutely beautifully, and that was the quiver. The way that that works is, regardless of if you're left or right-handed, whenever you pull out your bow, your quiver will automatically switch sides. So if you're right-handed, your quiver will be on your left when you pull out the arrow. If you're left-handed, it'll be on your right. One area that this can get a little confusing, and I found myself doing this, but it was pretty funny after I realized what was happening, is if you throw your bow while you're in combat, you will not get your bow back until you've exited combat. So when you lose your bow and it's out there just sitting on the floor, every time you try and pull it out from behind you, you're just pulling out arrows. So I thought that was pretty funny, but I thought it was worth mentioning because the same thing happens with Connor's Tomahawk. It used to not be that way, but they did add an update that if you threw it and that counts as combat, it will essentially do the same thing and not come back to you until you've completely exited combat. Just like any other game, you will have to replenish your ammo, whether that be the knives or the arrows. You can do this in 2 different ways. If you're someone that likes to take and hide the bodies of your downed enemies, you can go over to the body, pull the knife out, and then just put it back in your inventory. Same thing with the arrows. Or you can find the specific chests around the level as well as specific spawn points on rooftops, usually by some sort of enemy, that you can replenish those at as well. Now, it's not really hard and you will probably run out early, but again, if you're not playing stealthily, that's kind of on you for having to use 2 arrows or 2 knives for every single kill. As long as you are playing smart, you should not run out of arrows. And realistically, if you're playing smart, you should be able to go and retrieve them. The very last consumable you unlock is the smoke bomb, which I personally didn't find myself using much until the later game. As someone who played stealth constantly, I didn't really find situations where I became overwhelmed by a lot of guards and really needed to weigh in and use these. It's insanely useful. I would say that this is probably the most overpowered piece of equipment you get. Smoke bombs don't actually only do one thing. Although they do break line of sight and make it easier for you to kind of hide, they also temporarily revert any enemy hit by them to the initial undetected status. So what that means is, say you're surrounded by 3 enemies, you can throw a smoke bomb down, pull a throwing knife, throw one, throw a second one, and then dash at your enemy for an assassination. This is probably some of the most John Wick stuff you will have in Assassin's Creed Nexus, and when you pull it off, it is insanely satisfying. And for me, not really knowing that I could do this until I needed to, I didn't think of the possibilities until about 3 times into this. So keep that in mind. Smoke bombs are going to be your friend when you unlock those. So I do want to talk about the world overall for each of these individual characters. I'm not going to go into great detail or anything like that, but I feel like Ezio and Connor were kind of one note. Connor definitely had more diversity than Ezio, but I feel like Cassandra had the most diversity within her missions. Now, while Ezio and Connor both have 6 missions, Cassandra is relegated to 4. This may be the reason I feel like there's so much diversity, but it also might be the fact that I didn't play Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So to me, all of this is technically newer. That being said, I feel like they probably could have done more with Cassandra and added another 2 missions, but doesn't really matter. More than likely, it was a design choice based on the fact that she had already had a recent game. But just look at some of these locations. You can see a lot of stone, a lot of wood, and then there's Cassandra. Before I move on to my next section, which is going to be missions, I do want to clarify that missions do play a pivotal role in the diversity that you're going to see with architecture. You are going to have very unique methods of traversal within some of these locations, as well as some of what I would consider to be the most diverse locations, especially when it comes to some of these puzzles. So let's go ahead, start talking about some of these missions, but I did want to make sure that I clarified the overall uniqueness comes from a lot of these interiors rather than the exterior set pieces that you have within Assassin's Creed Nexus. When we do talk about uniqueness, this can pertain to anything, visuals, architecture, or even just the traversal method. But for Connor's mission that he has to go into a jail and break out of a Brotherhood contact, that for me really hit something. I'm not sure what it was, but the way that you traverse across the rafters in this specific mission really give me Dishonored vibes, and I felt like that was probably one of the best executed missions in the game, just because of that reason alone. If I wanted to, could traverse that whole entire map for the most part, the major big areas, just doing rafters and either, taking out guards with aerial assassinations or sneaking up behind them if I wanted to. But this was that first unique location that had that first unique interior that just was kind of different from what you would see in the outside areas of the game. Moving on to talk specifically about a mission type, this is a trail mission, and if you know what a trailing mission is, you know that they are horrendous, and believe me, I believe they are just as horrendous as you do. I think it's the fact that we have to go at a forced pace, as well as sometimes it just seems like there are no areas for us to keep up with this target. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to talk necessarily highly of them, but there was one that had Cassandra following a guy that is pretty much known in the area, and he is given an invitation to a party. We need to acquire that invitation, and he's kind of going around talking to people, and I felt like the conversations that he had, as well as the conversations that were happening around the area, really did add to the immersion and kind of made me care a little bit more about tailing the guy, because it did kind of drop story lore and a little bit of hints on who he was, and pretty much showed me that, wow, everybody really does hate this guy, but that's because he kind of just talks himself up for no apparent reason. You'll find that out. I will kind of say that although I don't enjoy trailing missions at all, and they are probably the worst type of missions to have in games, I think here it is okay only because it is a VR scene. It is a VR game. You have that first person immersion, and it really does add to that immersion. Whereas when you are playing like a third person flat game or even a first person flat game, it doesn't feel like I have the freedom to kind of act or do what I want. Whereas in VR, it does feel like I need to be more present. Furthermore, within this same mission, you do eventually obtain that invitation and you are invited to a party where you have to locate a guest. This is probably the best location, not necessarily the most unique, but it is probably the best location because of how different it kind of plays out. So whenever you get to this mission, just keep that in mind. It is more of a different feel, if you will, compared to other Assassin's Creed games. You're not necessarily always using a crowd as a diversion or a sneak tactic. You're more or less kind of just intermingling to figure out where you need to be. This will kind of have you noticing smaller details, which are very important in a VR game, as the VR medium comes in and really has you feel a sense of presence, if you will. VR as a whole has probably made me feel the most immersed I ever have in a game, and anybody watching this review, you've played VR more than likely, and if you haven't and you're looking at this game as your first to get into VR, I'm very glad you're looking at the medium. But for everyone that has played VR, you will agree that VR is probably the most immersive medium available today. And those smaller details don't go unnoticed by us players. We look at those small details. We see the small facial details. We see the repetition in NPCs, so on and so forth. That when you have small details that you have your players see and they just don't fit right, it's very off-putting. It's very uncanny, if you will. For example, whenever I went to the food stands, regardless of me playing as Connor, Ezio, or Cassandra, I saw PNGs. And I get, from a big game development standpoint, there is a lot of stuff that is amazing about this game, and PNGs, obviously not being one of them, is more of a resource saver than anything else. So understand that I'm not necessarily knocking points for that. I get it from a game developer standpoint. It is just one of those things that it's like, could we have done something different? Could we have maybe done just linens and not necessarily had any food stands that had PNGs? Or maybe less food stands overall, because there are some areas, especially within Ezio's playthrough areas, that have these markets, that have these textile stands, that it felt like even then when I was doing that trail mission we spoke of earlier, I didn't feel like I was seeing food stands. I felt like I was seeing textiles and just a different type of trade service that was offered that was not food, that I felt offered a little bit more immersion because those assets were 3D. So again, very small gripe, but it was definitely something that threw me off, and I wouldn't necessarily say took away from the game as a whole, but it was just a little weird to see. Another thing that kind of breaks my immersion is when I hit a barrier. I will say that when I was on Ezio's missions as well as Cassandra's missions, that didn't really happen. I think that was more or less because the objectives were more close or more intertwined with wherever you spawned, whereas Connor's were across the map. So I won't fault them for that necessarily. However, the way that some of the enemies are placed do have you potentially hitting a barrier to try and either go around and get that enemy from a flank, or you get to a point where you are really just into the parkour and just into the feel of running across these rooftops in Boston or Newport or wherever you are within Connor's areas, and you then hit a wall and it just immediately breaks that immersion. I understand, again, it comes down to resources, and the scale of this thing is relatively big, especially for the power that's offered, but hitting a barrier was probably one of the worst possible things that could happen in-game. We are done talking about this specific section. However, I always love clarifying after I do say anything, is this is more to inform you on your purchase rather than take away points, because as I said, this really comes down to the resources available on these standalone headsets. Could they have done more if it was on PC or PlayStation VR 2? Absolutely. I know this, you know this, we all understand this. However, Meta paid for the game, so they are going to ask for exclusivity. That all being said, please understand that these small gripes that I have within the world design come down to resources and not a lack of trying from the developers. The user experience is probably one of the most hit or miss areas that you can have within your VR game, and this all comes down to either comfort or the expectation of that player. If you have new players, more likely they are going to be prone to motion sickness and don't have a lot of expectation of VR norms because they don't necessarily understand VR norms. Whereas you have more veteran players, such as myself, that are not prone to motion sickness can fly planes and do loop-de-loops and ride roller coasters and all this other stuff and never become sick. That being said, I'm a player that has certain VR expectations, and that is what this section is kind of relegated to. What is the user experience? What can you expect from Assassin's Creen Nexus? And firstly, I want to praise them. I want to say that the level of comfort settings that they have, down to the vignette, the fear of heights, the nose, or virtual nose, if you will, options that you have are great. I love this. I'm very happy that new players have that option and they can, for the most part, do that and use those options to hopefully combat that motion sickness or any motion sickness that they would potentially get. But there are other things here that are just like, why would you do that? Why would you make this decision specifically? Why is this something that you thought was going to fly, if you will, with veteran VR players or just people as a whole? Let me talk about the first bad thing you're going to deal with within your user experience, and that's the first initial boot up of the game. You're pretty much going to be met with a 2-minute load screen. First, you're going to connect to the Ubisoft servers, which isn't necessarily part of that 2-minute load screen. But then you're also asked to sign into your Ubisoft Plus account. It's not a requirement. I will state that here. However, even having it in a VR game is a waste of time and breaks a VR rule of having a secondary account, which is really annoying, whether that be Rec Room or Roblox or whatever have you. Signing into another secondary account is just not great on VR, and there just needs to be a better way to do it if you're going to require it or request it even. And I'm not sure if this 2-minute load screen could have gone anywhere else or if they could have done anything, but this is pretty much compiling shaders to make it so that your game runs and has those higher texture qualities. So don't get me wrong, it's important that it's there. I just hate that I'm standing for 2 minutes doing nothing. I can't take the headset off because it's automatically going to shut down and go into standby mode because of the light sensor within the headset that is there to conserve your battery, but also doesn't let anything happen in the background within the game. Also wondering, could they have just put this in like the initial hacker screen where it's compiling in the background and maybe you just kind of watch a video, so I'm not getting the same load screen animation that's like 7 seconds long for 2 minutes straight? I'm not trying to rag on the game here or anything like that, but a lot of this section is kind of that. So moving on to what I would consider another very strange design decision, although at points it is very helpful. While in cutscenes or any like delivery scenes with NPCs that are just doing dialogue, if you put your controllers down, it automatically is going to pause the game for you. There's no way to turn off this feature as far as I can tell. And if they've added it since I have started this review, which was multiple months ago, congrats. That just means I was right and this mechanic was implemented in a horrifying way. That being said, I appreciate the auto pause, I do, but if it's in a cutscene or a dialogue delivery scene, I don't need it. I don't care. I'm getting a drink of water. I've been playing VR for, maybe an hour or half an hour, and I need something to drink while I'm watching this cutscene, because cutscenes I cannot interact with. I can't do anything with. There's no quick time events or anything like that other than your combat, which is essentially a quick time event. But I don't have to interact with this. All I have to do is watch and listen. I should be able to get a drink of water without my game automatically pausing for any given reason whatsoever. To praise this design, I will say, if I were to drop a controller while I'm playing the game, it will auto pause. I love that. That's fantastic. I'm in the middle of combat, but hey, maybe someone needs something. I can just drop the controllers automatically pausing. I like that. That's very cool. I think more games should implement that. I would say I get a little bit worried when the potential sensor within those controllers maybe go bad and it automatically pauses your game and there's no disengage option for that option. But that's a story for another day. It's good design, but it's bad that it's even an option that's going to happen within dialogue when you're not able to engage with the cutscene in any way, shape, or form. While on the topic of NPCs and cutscenes, I want to state that the NPCs in this game can be a blessing or a curse when it comes to the cutscenes overall. There needed to kind of be something that was talked about within the team that said, okay, if we're doing a cutscene, what are we doing? How are we going to make those work? Because whenever it came to cutscenes that were with Sean, Rebecca, or Dominica, I was a static player. But when I was in the Animus, there were cutscenes that either I was static or I could move around freely. The ones that would allow me to move around freely were very weird because the players, or NPCs I should say, would not follow me. They would every once in a while recheck themselves, if you will, where they would say, oh, where's the player? Let me look over there. But other than that, there were times that NPCs were having conversations with me that I could just move around and they would not follow. This is a huge no-no, especially when it comes to VR immersion. And there's actually a talk that I watched way back. I want to say it was like 2022 or something like that. But there was a GDC talk from one of the Polyarch developers, or I believe she was an artist. And she talked about, and the title of the video was Engaging VR Storytelling, a Moss Postpartum. And I will link that below or in the top right here. It's in one of the two areas. But they pretty much talked about the methods that they used to really engage with where the player was looking, as well as guaranteeing that the player did not miss something that was happening. So it seems like the Red Storm developers didn't really look at that or really look into that. They had a lot of like sound or movement, which unfortunately it seems that they didn't use any gaze detection. That was one of the things that the speaker from Polyarch talked about, was using gaze detection. And we know that they use gaze detection in Assassin's Creed Nexus. They use it for the bow and the sword. Not the sword, sorry, the throwing knives. But they didn't want to use it with NPCs, and they could have just as easily made all of this just static and you just have to stand there. But giving the ability for your player to free roam, you would think that, okay, maybe we should make these NPCs actually follow the player and have more of a attachment, if you will, to say, hey, player's moving this way, make sure that the NPC moves their head to follow them. And yeah, you might get some funny stuff out of that, but it still would be less immersion breaking than the NPC talking to essentially air in front of them until the next line starts and it's like, okay, I have now started the next voice dialogue. Let me look and see where the player is. The final part of NPCs that I want to talk about is the variety. And I'm not going to deduct any points from this or anything major from this overall, because I understand it has to do with a lot of the resources that are there. Unfortunately, I think that NPCs were probably some of the worst parts of Assassin's Creed Nexus, because you would see the same NPC standing in the exact same clothes with the exact same face right next to each other. It just was one of those things that were kind of like, maybe you could have added some more color options to these clothes, because yeah, there's the same clothes, some of them have color options, but there are other ones that just don't have any color options. And maybe they should have thought of a way to make some of this different. Think of the voice lines in like the Elder Scrolls Oblivion, where you'd have like the same person doing like 17 different characters' voice lines, and it's all just kind of the same. Or like the guards themselves are all the same. Now I understand in that, the guards have a uniform, but these are all individual unique NPCs. There needs to be some sort of uniqueness to each of them, and I'm not going to say that it needs to be wholeheartedly insanely unique, but I shouldn't be able to walk 5 feet and see the exact same NPC, if you will. Accessibility is probably one of, if not the most important part of any VR game, seeing as how there's such a wide variety of different players, some that will be very prone to motion sickness, some that can do a million flips and turns on something they can't control and not be sick at all. But Assassin's Creed, as I stated earlier, sets what I think is a new bar for a lot of these options. If you're someone that is prone to motion sickness, they have a tunneling vignette, but it's not like other games where it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. They have that option, but they also make it so that you can have blinders on the side, the top and bottom, and actually narrow those individually, which is very nice. And I think it's probably one of the best ways that they could have implemented that feature. They also have a virtual nose, which sounds weird. They do have different sizes for this, but apparently they found that being able to perceive someone's nose, or your own nose, I should say, in VR and using that as kind of a reference point helps immensely, which didn't know. Very cool. I think that's probably one of the most unique ways I've seen them do something within VR for motion sickness. And they also have different move styles. Obviously teleport, obviously blink, but whenever you're doing parkour, there's a few things that will get to people. One, the fear of heights, which we've already talked about. They have options for that. But they also have a parkour option where if you're having an issue getting to a specific spot, or maybe you don't want to be able to look down when you're going over a drop from building to building, you can use these options. It's kind of like teleport, where one of them will just provide a line of where you're going to be jumping, and then the other one will be a blink teleport where you just click the left stick and it automatically goes across whatever gap you're trying to get across. Another thing, and this is something that I've actually seen before, they call it Animus Grid, and if I still have that video up, it's going to be in the top right or linked below, but this essentially makes it so that you have a grid within your play space that can be used as a 360-degree reference point to say, okay, I'm not actually moving, and it helps your brain kind of understand that you're not going to physically be moving, and your brain doesn't need to compensate for that because it has that locked reference point. And honestly, I think this should be an OS level, ground level feature on all Quest headsets because of how well it works. There is one accessibility feature called hidden geometry, and they just need to remove this thing as a whole, unless it's something that makes it so they decided, yeah, well, we couldn't make it so they couldn't look in walls, so we're just going to add this thing to make it so that we're being quote unquote considerate. This is a horrible feature and has no indication on what's happening, and actually is glitched a few times to where it made me have to reboot my game. So take this feature out, or just turn it down to the lowest setting and try not to get too close to where your head goes into the wall, because you'll ask yourself, why is this happening and why does my game look like this, just to try and fix it and do a whole reset. It's very weird, and I don't even know why it's in the game. Hopefully I have some footage of it, honestly, because ugh. Before I give you my final thoughts on Assassin's Creed Nexus, I just want to say that I appreciate anyone that has made it this far, and I appreciate anyone that's watched any of my videos. It means a lot that anybody even takes the time to look, especially this far within a review, on something that is an older game. But I, more than anything, am glad that you're here, and if you have enjoyed the video thus far, please hit the like button, and if you enjoy these very long form reviews, hit subscribe, hit the bell notification, because this is what I want to do. This is what I want to provide to my community. This is what I want to offer to YouTube as a whole, and I'd love to be able to do a lot more of these. Unfortunately, I need to have a job out in the world for the time being. I don't make enough money doing this, which is fine. I don't really have an issue with this. I don't think this is ever going to become a full-time thing. But since I want to chase that dream regardless, I have activated channel memberships for the channel. And if you want, and you want to see me be able to do this full-time and create nothing but amazing in-depth reviews for the community as a whole, especially for the VR community, definitely make sure to check out the membership tiers down below. That being said, I want to thank all of you who have decided to watch. Let's go ahead and talk about what I initially thought this Assassin's Creed Nexus review was going to be versus what it actually is. Originally, I thought this video was going to probably be one of, if not my most critical review ever. And overall, Assassin's Creed Nexus was one of the games that had me very worried for VR as a medium. But the more I played, the more I fell in love with the game. It offered me the nostalgia of my childhood, and a stealth game I believe is worth experiencing for all VR users. Are there definitely rough edges? Absolutely. But I think if you can look at the game and how it was designed to be versus where you think you are and who the game was designed for, which is everyone, I think it's a great addition to the AAA VR catalog, and the worlds, the stealth, and just the experience of being a deadly assassin come together like peanut butter and jelly. Unfortunately, if you are someone who's going to be playing this game just to fight and not engage with the stealth mechanics of Assassin's Creed as a franchise, I'm going to have to tell you to avoid the game. Assassin's Creed Nexus is a stealth first, and combat, well, you heard the combat section, and if you didn't, I'd recommend going back and listening to that. But to conclude, if you're looking for a stealth game, Nexus has you locked in with something I consider to be a very pro-stealth genre, and works really well. I can say that if I had the chance to buy it again with the knowledge that I have now, I would still buy it. Although I would still buy Assassin's Creed Nexus again, I won't lie and say I'm not disappointed that Splinter Cell got canceled. Now, I understand that this is part of kind of another video that I've made, which I'll link up in the top right, but I think Ubisoft kind of knows what they need to do now, and I think an Ubisoft Splinter Cell game in VR, which essentially is just Assassin's Creed with guns when it comes to stealth, would be amazing. They've already done Hitman 3, not Ubisoft obviously, but we have a Hitman VR game that is coming, even if it's low poly, like PS2 style graphics, but Splinter Cell. It would probably sell really well. And the CEO was disappointed in the sales of Assassin's Creed Nexus. I don't think he's looked at the medium. Although I do think, and I will state, that maybe the CEO needs to just try Assassin's Creed Nexus. After all, his company's tagline is, "Playing is believing."